So I should call there for. Hey.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
You're gonna be working with Rachel when you're on board.
Oh, okay. Nice to meet you.
Okay.
Well, you.
Good, good.
Been a
It's
while.
good to see you.
You too.
Yeah, I called him.
You got the call too? Like, did I let you know before they left, you know?
Oh. I was like, so we weren't sure if it was the whole venue or just.
No.
They're not ready. No, they had to cancel everything from December and January. Wow. That's terrible.
Are you talking about the Yorktown? So I went on a tour of Yorktown in this late summer, and the person that gave us the tour said that she was scheduled to have her wedding there. She was going to be the first wedding on October 15th.
That didn't happen.
Well, and then when I went on the tour, I'm like, I don't think you're going to be ready. They were talking about September.
Yeah.
And it was August, and like, it was a shit show in there, you know, and I thought there is no way this is going to be ready before, you know.
Is there ever is there ever
So they canceled
Rachel
everything?
to that camera, because it's really low?
There's not. For the camera,
Yeah, the
It's
camera
pointing
above
down
the TV,
toward-
see how
it's that one.
Yeah.
I think.
Get it?
There you go.
I see a Logitech.
You need it.
I think you just need to move, like, adjust the
That
position.
You get it?
That's better. We can see the back.
But I was really excited about having a function there. So I was super excited.
You were more excited than you, Rachel. We were conspiring to burn it down.
I was excited about just being able to do the walk
I know,
around
I
town.
know.
Yeah. What a bummer.
So where do we go?
The window.
We say, Linda, we don't have a whole lot of choices.
It's okay. It's still a hotel, so I can still drink it.
Yeah.
Crash.
Yeah.
Hey,
Hello, how are you? No Peter yet?
I say hi to
No, I was texting.
this is Aaron. She's
What's
our
up,
new
Aaron?
team leader.
Hi, Erin, I'm Stephanie.
Nice to meet you in person, Steph. I saw your face.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's me.
Yeah. Hey, Belinda, how are you? Good. Great to see you. Oh. Hey, bounce something off you real quick. Sure. Just had a 20K appraisal drop. Ouch. But I feel like it's not justified. We listed at 300, at 8 offers, 25. We could have, I think we could list it at 310, but we did the threshold for the interest rates and stuff.
Yeah.
So no big appraiser
You
on
want me to
that.
send it and
They
you watch
paid like
that? Tell me why.
3K.
I think that would be awesome.
He got just at some place.
How'd you know those? Or did you? I thought I saw you
The other
walking in.
agent, well, here's reaching out with agent. Didn't know about capital gains taxes, I guess they were with their town.
If you get two things from it, it'll be good, you know what I mean? Yeah. So.
So they want to switch to an FHA, which is.
Okay.
good.
11, yeah.
But he's already- I mean, I'll get an appraisal, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, well, yeah.
Give it a shot, see if it gets higher.
We were gonna get it.
You can have the comps. Do it under a license. I think it's really cool. You know, yeah.
Few things I enjoy more.
Yeah. They do have a $7,000 appraisal gap in here, so the other day, I paid 307,
Yeah.
but I have to switch that to J. But then I have to take it to the appraisal anyway. Right.
That's why I was.
So it's like, well, if I'm doing another appraisal anyway.
I'm like, hey.
So that's for every age. I would, what is your salary?
Sorry, Bob. I thought-
500. I mean, to me, I feel like sometimes I can tell him if it comes out of 310, 315, you need to just. Like 300, I feel like it's low, the other agent feels like it's low.
But then it was.
Yeah.
just,
It feels
50
low.
miles included, 30
Yeah,
miles.
that does feel tight.
There's a lot of places.
I feel like we keep the FHA, this is what I'm thinking, is keep the FHA and do an FHA appraisal, but I want first sellers. to contact me the same. I said, or I want your buyers to forget this appraisal for 300K. Because whatever the value comes out for this FHA one is what the sale
But
price.
it's not
You
showing.
know what I mean? It's what the
It's
contract
not
shows.
showing that.
I'm done.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Let me, Sheila, I'm gonna read this about her before.
It literally just happened.
So that is-
2 minutes ago.
My, like, my initial thought
I
is,
know what a pain in the ass.
is that FHA loan would come back the same.
Well, if they came back the same before, then I think we have a discussion.
That didn't happen yet,
Right?
Right.
Where we were,
But to me, I just don't want her buyers being like, well, this one came back at
when we
300. I
went through that
want
whole.
to forget this one. If we're moving on to this new appraisal, and we get the value better, then it's fair. You know what I mean? Like, that's my.
I was gonna
negotiation.
grab one.
I would be on board with that. Yeah.
I was gonna grab one.
Get a bus for after the venue part of it. Whoever wants to, but spending at the downtown in the bus. And bring it back. Yeah.
Oh,
I said, I'm sure these guys would be.
Oh, gotcha, okay.
This system, I wasn't trained.
Where's your sidekick? David.
Oh, no.
Oh, really?
It's showing
Ah.
that. It should show me.
He said he may tag along with you.
I was hoping.
Is there
How
an
you doing?
input button or something that you can do? There is, and it's fine. What do you want this, what do you want that?
Wants that camera to
To show up here so that people who are logged in can see Mr. Ruth up here. Because right now, everybody's seeing the back.
Oh, they're seeing everybody in the audience.
Yeah, it's not showing it, and I don't know.
You need to switch to the back
You can watch me, my donut.
Listening to him, but I'm mad at him, I'm mad at him right now. But I don't know what that's gonna do. So right now, the input is set on for all these to show the same. Peter, do you have a presentation?
Yeah.
Yes.
If you want to do it HDMI, I have it on
Yep.
the computer. So whatever it is.
And we can plug in.
Just tell me.
Sure. Perfect.
Thank you, appreciate it.
How's your day going?
It's all right. Sorry it's a little bit late, but yeah, it's one of those hectic crazy things. Which
Yeah.
one?
So we should be able to pull, we can probably plug in right in.
So we're doing HDMI, is that what- Yes.
I get the things all the time. I can go
It's like
downtown.
three, yes.
And I was looking at it, I was like, look. I was like, you got a lot of work.
The cord should be in the box there underneath.
When
It should be.
Oh, okay.
But you know, audio.
Hold on. Should be able to put it right in. Welcome to our first guest.
So I have.
Which would
so
still
my
be
system
cool,
is over
right?
there. If I had a little. And then it's gonna bring it up.
Maybe somebody has a haircut. I think on Drea, it's not.
Right.
I don't know.
Hello.
No, I think from the Zoom. Might be from the Zoom too, if everybody's not muted.
Yeah, it's probably on Andrea.
What? There's somebody in here.
There you go.
There we go. Alright. Let's figure that.
There we go.
Perfect. And
Getting there.
would you like it on the back TV so you can see it?
I guess, yeah, sure.
We are getting high tech here, man.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
Wow, Aaron's making moves.
Woo-hoo,
Now we
look
need
at
the
that.
camera.
Can everybody see okay?
Yep.
Oh, and there's enough
Great.
screens.
Okay.
Awesome.
So welcome to our first Training Tuesday. We're excited. This is going to start to become a weekly event. We're going to do a training at 11 and a training at 1 o'clock. I'm working on a schedule that I'm hoping to have out by the office meeting tomorrow. So fingers crossed. I'll be working, starting the midnight oil tonight. I'd like to introduce Peter. For those of you who don't know Peter, he is with Stock and Leader. He is also the liaison for RAYAC and supports us there. So, and we're excited to learn about contracts, do a little bit deeper dive, and I told everybody to bring their questions. So
Gotcha, perfect.
I'll put you on the hot seat
Awesome.
here.
Well, I look forward to a lot of familiar faces. So thank you guys for having me. I'm going to try to keep it as interactive as possible. So if you guys do have questions or you have any stories, I guess, or anything you want to share, or even just questions as it pertains to current transactions you have, just let me know. This is tailored off of a course that I do actually teach for CE credit. I apologize and have to disclose in advance. You're not going to get that today, so hopefully it doesn't result in everybody leaving. But it does kind of hit home for a lot of the issues that I see, most importantly with contracts interpretation, things that many well-seasoned agents kind of, I think, don't fully appreciate. That's a very nice way of putting it, or just simply don't understand, don't want to take the time to kind of dive into exactly what it involves. So just a few disclaimers though. Obviously as an attorney, I have to tell you, I'm not giving you any type of specific legal advice. So I do offer a hotline. Everybody should know that through the Realtors Association of York and Adams Counties. It is my office line, 717-846-9800. So if anybody does have an issue, you can feel free to call that. It is completely confidential. We'll go through the whole process and I'll answer to the best of my ability. But obviously today I'm not giving you any specific legal advice. We're just going over the contract in general. If anybody does want a copy of the PowerPoint, I'm happy to provide it as well. Although we have to put this big watermark on it, not for legal advice and things like that. So, but a lot of it, like I said, the contracts I've just pulled directly from PAR in order to translate them. So on the hotline, I would say the contract is probably contract interpretation, agreement of sale in particular, and the seller's disclosure are probably like 80 to 90% of the calls that I get. I get someone like licensure and brokerage interaction, and sometimes on like really not so pleasant things that other agents are accused of doing. But for the most part, it's like, hey, I have a client who wrote an offer. They had a financing contingency, and now that the rates are so high, they're not going to qualify. They don't want to go forward with a loan. How can I get out of that? How can the buyer get out of that? And normally it's one of those, like I said, I can't really give them specific advice, but what we'll do is we'll go over the contract. And you would be astonished how many agents, even what I call very well-seasoned agents who've been in this profession a long time, kind of has some issues with interpretation and things that go along with that. But just to go forward, like I said, if anybody does have specific questions or specific areas of the contract they want to go into, just let me know. These are what I call the highlights of the preparation and use of the PAR agreement of sale. Just to reiterate, try to use that par form as much as you can. I defer to your brokerage and what they instruct you to do, but every time you kind of devolve, I'll say, or try to modify that agreement, you can expose yourself. Now you're kind of playing an attorney and you're playing a realtor as well. So I get it as an attorney who is practicing and somebody who is very, I feel closely involved in real estate in terms of my practice. You are practicing law to a certain extent. I mean, you're drafting documents that are then legally enforceable in a court of law, often with little to no oversight by an attorney, right? There's nobody sitting there saying, oh, yeah, you filled in, you've checked all the boxes, everything looks good, go ahead and send that out. So I get it. So you're kind of in that kind of tricky spot, but hopefully this will kind of give you a little bit of the overview, some of the highlights, and then we can go into a little bit more detail. Obviously, identify your dates and parties, identify the property and your purchase price. Anybody who is selling any type of vacant land, farms, large tracts of land, a lot of times you'll have like $1 per acre. Make sure you identify how that's to be established. You wouldn't believe how often, you have a farmer who's owned a farm, their parents have owned it for, before that. And in the assessment records, it says 105 acres. But they don't realize that that description was taken from a survey that might have been done in the 1800s, okay? We've improved a lot in accuracy. So obviously a survey that they go out and pay for now from one of the developer might come back and it turns out, wait a minute, you only have 95 acres or something like that, given the discrepancy. So now you're in a position of, wait, we said it was price per acre, but now we're not exactly sure on what per acre value we're going off of. Is it what their survey says or what I thought we were getting into? So again, be cognizant of that. Also identifying your property in those cases. When you're looking at a subdivision plan, you might not have a street address, right? So identify it by lot, identify it by legal description, refer to a plan that's been recorded as well as the lot number that's in that plan. Identify fixtures and personal property. So there's a huge difference, obviously, between real estate, things that you are physically attached to the ground, okay? So what do I mean by that? It's not like a mobile home where you dropped it and it can be picked up and moved. These are things that, like, obviously you're looking at right here, things that are attached to the ground. You can't remove this building without causing significant damage to those improvements. So that is called realty in terms of the law. That's real estate. There's also personalty and what we'll call tenant fixtures or tenant property. So all of that factors in. So you have to be cognizant in my working with a commercial seller here. Is there property inside that they're going to want to carve out and keep for themselves? Is there property that I think is otherwise going to go with the property, but it might not? Okay, solar panels are a great example. Always get a lot of questions about solar panels. Technically, they're attached to the roof, to the of the property, but they can sometimes be removed without causing significant damage. A lot of times they're leased, right? They're financed. Some owners have to pay for them. Other owners are getting paid by the energy companies for producing that electricity. So all of that should be disclosed, hopefully, in first your seller's disclosure, and then should transfer over into your agreement of sale. All right. Other items that are kind of commonplace, but what about the electronic devices? So for example, your PowerPoint presentation, little projector back there, is that to be treated as real estate? Because technically it's attached to the wall, right? It's drilled in. Could you remove it without damaging it? Yes, but the agreement of sale carves out that if it's hardwired, okay, and if it's for any type of security, if it's hardwired, that stays with the property unless you carve it out and say that it's accepted. Likewise, if it's just like a little Nest doorknob that you plug in or door camera, and it can be taken out of the plug, you don't have to do any hardwiring, that will not go with the property unless they include that in your inclusions. So make sure, and I know the pace, unfortunately has kind of slowed down a little bit, but now is really, I think, a good time. Start honing in on those skills of making sure what you're saying in those contracts makes sense. What I always say, if I'm not available on the hotline, or you just don't want to call me, I get it. I forgot to say, it is all anonymous. So don't feel pressured like I'm going to call up somebody and say, oh, you won't believe what this agent asked me. But that's when I say use the buddy system. So call up one of the other agents in your office, just, hey, can you come over and take a look at this language? Let me know if that makes sense, right? So we're going to include this, but we're going to exclude that. And more importantly, if any repair is over $2,500, then the seller's only going to go up to that amount. Make sure that's what is actually being written. Okay, that's one of the most important things I can hopefully impart on you today.
Hey, Peter.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't mean
Yeah.
to interrupt. I don't know
ahead.
if anybody in the room can help. We can't see your presentation. We are just seeing the Zoom screen.
Okay, Kate, I'm not sure what I can do about that, but
Yeah,
let
just
me,
share your screen on Zoom.
I don't think I'm connected to Zoom is the problem. Because
Yeah, because
that's
we're-
on a different one, right?
because we connected to the HMAC. Kate, if, let me text you, but I'll see what I can do. Thank you.
We'll try to figure that out. So for your date and time is of the essence, everybody should be familiar. Time is of the essence means, let's say a date has to be by that date, right? So if you say July 1st and it's July 2nd at 12:01 a.m. and everybody knows that now because we have DocuSign and it's date stamped, you are technically out of time. And unless the other party agrees to give you an extension retroactively, you're out of time. So that contract time period has expired. But for your dates in particular, make sure you're paying attention to this, okay? I teach a new member orientation once a month for all the new members that are coming in. And that's one of the things I hit on all the time is make sure you're looking at those dates. A lot of the dates in the contract, that is what, 16 pages long, 13, 14 pages long. It's like size 2 typeface, okay? Some things are bolded, some things are underlined. There's certain things that are blank that you have to fill in. And if you don't fill them in, then there's default provisions that provide, right? So a lot of that is just making sure you're paying attention and timing out those times. And there's also a lot of confusion again that we'll go over with the inspection contingency period. So when does the contingency period end? When does your negotiation period begin? When does that end? And then when does that 2-day kind of drop dead period start? Mortgage contingency. So everybody should know PAR came out with a revised agreement of sale in July that they quickly changed again in August regarding the financing contingency specifically. So what they were trying to do, and I know this may shock some of you, hopefully none of you, but even if you have said my contract is not contingent upon finance, even before this change, the buyer was still allowed to go out and seek finance, right? And the contract language specifically said that the seller must provide access to appraisers and inspectors and anybody else, right? As required in the contract or in the mortgage contingent or any other contingency that's contained therein. So they actually, when you get that cash offer and you say, oh, wait, this is great. It's cash offer, no inspections, no contingencies. I'm gonna go out and take the lockbox off because nobody needs to get in, right? And then you get a call from the other agency. Wait a minute, we have our inspector out there, the appraiser's out there for the financing, and you're like, wait a minute, it's a cash deal. You waive financing, right? It's not the case. Just because you waive financing, you can still go out and get it. Again, that's a huge kind of a lot of jaws hit the ground. Like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. So I think a lot of it deals with educating your seller, and that's what a lot of the changes that came out in most recently in August, that's what they tried to address. I think it's yet to be seen. I'll defer to you all in terms of its ease of use and communicating that to your buyers and sellers. But at the end of the day, that's what they were trying to get to. A waiver of contingency. So believe it or not, you can always try to argue it if you ever have to go to mediation. But in the agreement of sale, it says unless you've objected to something before closing, you're taking the property in its as-is condition and you're waiving anything else in terms of any contingency as it relates to that property or any representation. So again, it usually ties back to a failure to disclose, but your contract does contain that language. So unless you've elected them an appraisal contingency you think is just automatically built into financing, maybe not. Maybe you actually have to have that in there. And if you haven't elected the appraisal contingency, it could be in a situation where you're no longer going to be able to object if the appraisal comes in low. Inspections and the inspection contingency options. I said before on the hotline, I get a lot of calls on this. I'm actually teaching a class out in Hanover next week to some Adams County agents, but the main question always comes up on the hotline especially is, I put in my contract, inspections are for buyers' informational purposes only, right? So what does that mean? Does that mean that the buyer can perform them, but is not going to provide the reports back to the seller? Does it mean that the buyer can do that, perform the inspections, but then they're not going to provide it to the seller and they're not going to seek to get out of the contract or ask for any repairs or anything like that? Or does it literally mean that the buyer, he or she gets them, or they get them, and then that's all they're going to do, and then they'll fix the property up after they purchase? But if all you put in the contract is inspections are for buyers' informational purposes only, in my opinion, it can mean any of those things, if not more at this point. So now you have a buyer and a seller who are going to fight about it saying, well, I just meant that I didn't want to see it and you still had to buy the property, but that's not what it says if you just say for informational purposes only. So make sure you're paying attention to that and finding out what those options are. There was a change recently. All reports now have to be provided with the inspection when you're replying back for your BRI. So If you're saying, hey, I want you to fix A, B, and C, make sure you're including all of those reports, right? Now that we're kind of coming back into an inspection time period where more and more buyers, I think, are being successful in negotiating to get them. Zoning classification and verification of use. This is for kind of anybody selling any type of mixed use properties or properties that appear to be residential or maybe they're commercial. But it also deals with pre-existing non-conforming uses. I teach this at new member orientation. There's 72 municipalities in Newark. There's 34 municipalities in Adams County. Okay, that's just 2 counties we're talking about. So 100 different ways, over 100 different ways to do zoning, 100 different ways to treat pre-existing non-conforming uses in the way. Look for notices and assessments, certificates of occupancy. So the contract does talk about what's required in terms of those notices. What happens if there's a countywide reassessment in the middle of a contract? What happens if you're doing improvements as a seller and you now get a notice of an interim assessment and they're increasing your value from 100,000 to 150,000? So the tax liability is going to go up by half. What are you going to do? That will all hopefully be explained in the contract, and then you can it does allow, once you get a notice as a seller, you're required to then provide that to the buyer. Condo plan community, hopefully everybody is very familiar, knowledgeable about those. More and more I'm hearing about kind of lack of compliance from the association side. Associations are refusing to give documents. They're saying, well, we only give one resale certificate and it's the day of settlement or something absurd like that. When the law clearly says that they can't do that. But other than that, I'm going to assume everybody kind of knows the difference in how those things play out. Title survey costs, who pays for those, when they have to be ordered, and then finally the representations and releases. There's a drop dead and default provision, this paragraph 26G. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's basically the default for if you paid a deposit money as a buyer and you default as a buyer, all the seller gets is your deposit if they're successful. Doesn't mean they automatically get it. Doesn't mean you're still not able to go to mediation or to fight about it. But if they're successful, or if you just agree, that's the maximum amount of your liability. You say, hey, I lost my deposit and that's it. The question and the problem always comes up though is what if you haven't yet paid the deposit, right? So you have a default relatively early on, or what if the default is their failure to pay the deposit? At that point, what are you able to get out of it? And honestly, the answer is nothing. If you check that box, because you're limited to retaining deposit money that's actually been paid. The termination and release of deposits, there's only certain ways that those can be released, which we'll talk about. And then lastly, mediation. Anybody using these forms has to process any claim or dispute arising out of these forms through the mediation process. Can that be a foreign mediator? Could it be, and what I mean by foreign is somebody coming in from another jurisdiction? Does it have to be the York County Real Estate or the York and Adams County's Realtors Association process for mediation, or could it be through any other avenue? Very first thing, I always get a lot of questions and comments and concerns and question looks when I go over this, but this is the very first page of the standard agreement of sale. Like I said, it should be dated at the bottom, revised on 8/22 when it came out. But the very first thing, and this probably should have done that because I have to look back at it, but buyer mailing address, frequently that stuff is not filled in. I implore you guys to do that from a title side. It helps out so much. So that way we know where we're mailing things and with whom we can correspond with. But at the end of the day, that's completely your prerogative. Identify the property. We already talked about that. That's pretty relatively straightforward. But then we get into the agency relationships. And I tend to get a lot of questions on this, right? So we know that there's a buyer agent, where the buyer agent, you're just representing the buyer, nobody else in the transaction. So in that case, you would check your buyer agency for your broker because they're acting in a buyer agency as well. And then you would check your buyer agent and then fill in your information respectively. And then the seller, who would not be within your brokerage, right? Not within your brokerage, because that would be dual agency or designated agency, but somebody outside. So let's see, Pete Ruth brokerage and Shauna Taroso, I'll use her as an example. So Shauna's brokerage has the listing. I have the buyer representation. So I come in, I am a buyer agent, my broker's a buyer agent, Shauna and her broker are seller agent and seller agent respectively. So if you read immediately after that, all company licensees represent seller. My personal opinion, a lot of brokers get a little uneasy when they're thinking about like liability and restrictions like that. And they're like, wait a minute. So if all of the licensees in my company represent this seller or this buyer, well, in that case, if that one licensee who's actually working on their behalf messes up or does something that's like air and emissions insurance issue, what happens then? Because if all of those licensees represented the seller or the buyer, all those licensees are on the hook now, right? That's not correct. That is, from a legal perspective, that would not be applicable. Anybody who would be named in that lawsuit would be able to get out because they have no connection or no nexus to that suit. So the reason it says that is from an agency law perspective. You can't form an agency relationship with an actual agent, believe it or not. Your agency is formed with whom? Does anybody know? The broker, right? The broker is the one who holds that responsibility. They're the one who hold that relationship. So that's why they're talking about that. The other avenue you could pursue is, let's say they're both within the Peter Ruth brokerage. I represent the buyer and I also represent the seller. That is pure and simple. I'm a dual agent, right? Same broker, same agent. We're dual agent. Both of the clients not assumingly, but hopefully have consented to dual agency. You've gotten that in the consumer notice. You've gotten that in your listing or your buyer agency agreement. You fill out the form accordingly, right? So what happens then, I guess, first of all, if you're down in Maryland, just a teaching point, don't do that. That's not allowed. You can't represent a buyer and a seller in the same transaction. They don't acknowledge dual agency in that way. They do acknowledge it kind of as a designated agency, which I'll talk about next. But again, down in Maryland, you can't be on both sides as a buyer and a seller. Also, now you're in a relatively large brokerage. Let's say my brokerage is of similar size and I have a buyer agent and I have a seller agent, okay? So my buyer agent, although I'm the same broker, it's gonna be two different licensees on the right-hand side. In that case, again, everybody is gonna be your dual agent if they've consented, and then dual agent, same way, okay? But let's say your brokerage practice is designated agency. All right, so everybody hopefully knows what designated agency is. It's where I, as a broker, it's very important, the broker have made a decision that I'm going to designate a buyer agent and I'm going to designate a seller agent. And it's going to be effectively the same as if those agents are no longer in my brokerage together. Although they are, they're going to be treated as if they're separate. So any email or phone call that's incoming to the buyer agent, it's not going to be intercepted by the seller agent, or more importantly, in the age of teams, anybody on the seller agent's team, anybody on seller agent's staff, any transaction coordinator, anybody who's walking by the same inbox or the same fax machine, not that anybody sends those anymore, but any access to that information has to be restricted. The broker is the one on the hook at the end of the day. If they haven't taken that measure to make sure that there's that level of confidentiality, it's the broker's license potentially that's on the line, okay? But what I see a lot of times is, even when it's an out of office transaction, a lot of times they'll say, well, I am a buyer agent and I'm going to be a designated agent, a buyer agent with designated agency, because only the licensee named above represents the buyer. Because Joe in the cubicle next to mine, he doesn't represent the buyer. Only I represent the buyer, right? I'm the only one working. So sometimes it's a lack of confusion, but what I will say at the very outset, this is a broker-driven question. So I could teach this course in 9 different brokerages. You might have 9 different answers on how they want you to fill out that portion of the form. The main thing is find out how they want you to do it and stick with it. Don't modify it. Don't try to come up. I see a lot with newer agents when, again, my instruction to them, and no fault to them, is read the contract. Make sure you understand and are comfortable with the terms. But when you do read that, I can see how logically it's confusing, right? Only a licensee named above represents the buyer. Well, yeah, because not everybody in my brokerage represents that buyer. It's just me. Which maybe from a practical perspective is true, but from a legal agency perspective is incorrect, okay? So make sure you're aware of that. I see a lot of the designated agency for out-of-agent office deals. I also see what I consider to be an underutilization of actual designated agency practice. It has to be by the broker, right? They're the ones who are the driving force. I think it makes sense in a lot of circumstances. Pennsylvania adopted this because they don't want to have a situation where a broker has to, especially large brokerage operations, is constantly refer people out because, oh, well, we have the listing, we can't help you on the buyer side. But at the same time, anybody hopefully can see a buyer and seller, especially in a competitive market, they want you to vouch for them, right? They want you to be their their representative, somebody who goes to bat for them so that they can get the best deal possible. So if you're representing both sides, there's an inherent conflict, right? It's a very delicate balance, and that's one of the things I always say, make sure your broker is involved in that decision. I know here you have a great brokerage team, you guys know who they are, thankfully, and they can be involved in that decision-making process. Not every brokerage is the same, not every brokerage is as lucky, okay? I always joke, I get calls sometimes where somebody will call me and I'll say, hey, what does your broker say? Well, I don't even know who my broker is. Nobody here has done that, don't worry. But at the end of the day, I think it's very important, find out how they want you to practice in that scenario, in that context, and then follow their instruction and don't modify, okay? The last one I'll talk about is transaction licensee. I don't know how much that is occurring still, but that is where you're just hiring somebody for a very limited set of purposes or circumstances. So for example, I just need you to prepare an agreement of sale. I've gone out, I've got my buyer, I found them on my own, I don't want to pay a commission, but I need a contract and I don't want to pay an attorney the exorbitant rates that it's going to cost to do that. So can I just get you to prepare the contract for me and I'll pay you a $500 flat fee to do that? You know, transaction licensees can do that. Again, make sure your broker's okay with that type of relationship, but that's what a transaction licensee is. It's you're not getting the full scope of services. There really is no duties, fiduciary duties at that point that are owed because they're not a client. They're just a transaction affiliate, for lack of a better term. Okay, and then it kind of explains the dual agency or designated agency down here. So anybody have any questions on that? Pretty straightforward, I hope. Okay, perfect.
I'll ask the broker.
Good idea. And again, it could be different. There could be different brokerages that come up with different ways to do it, but that's the main thing is how you're going to check the box. So by this agreement dated, I kind of be remiss not to point this out. This is normally the process is that, you know, first the buyer is going to fill out this form, right? And they're going to write in the date that they actually fill out the form and send it to the seller. But then what happens is the seller gets it, right? And they're going out of town for a long weekend or whatever. They might not be able to respond the same day. How many of you actually go back and change that date? No, right? So the main thing is, and what I mean by this date is by this agreement dated up at the top. Because normally, like I said, the buyer just puts it in. We all look back, we go to the end of the contract and say, what's the last date that the last party signed or the last party initialed any contractual change, right? So just be aware because a lot of people will call up and they'll say, well, it's dated the 11th of November, but the last person didn't sign, so maybe like the 15th today. But then they go back to start all the contingency timing. They're like, all right, well, if it was signed on the 11th and the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and it doesn't apply. Okay, so the main thing to remember when you're looking at this, the date that the last party signed the agreement of sale is day 0. Day 1 is the day immediately after. And the reason for that is if you just took the last day, let's say that, and again, in this DocuSign world, I send off my form, or I'm the seller and I accept the buyer's offer at 11:59 on November 11th. So the last person to sign, it's dated November 11th. Are we really going to say that they had a minute of that day to complete an inspection, 11:59 p.m., and now all of a sudden we're on to the 12th and now it's day 2? So you always get the day after the last party has signed, essentially. That is your buffer. That's your day 1 when it comes to the start. Okay? So you have your purchase price, obviously pretty straightforward. Goes through your seller assist, what percentage that is, settlement possession date. Make sure it's an actual date. A lot of times if you're doing large subdivision or something like that, it'll be, hey, 15 days after final subdivision approval. Okay, is that 15 days after the 30-day appeal period has expired? Or is it just 15 days after the final decision? Because let's say you close on day 16, but everybody who's ever dealt with land development knows that there's a 30-day appeal period normally for any zoning decisions and things like that. And all of a sudden, day 17, a neighboring property owner files an appeal. So now your land development process is hung up, right? Can't move forward with that. And now we really don't know what time that contract is going to start or how that plays out. So make sure, articulate that specifically. Normally it's just going to be a date and you bump it out, but those are some things you have to start thinking about in a little bit different scenarios. For your municipal tax bills, again, making sure everything is kind of prorated. Anybody doing work in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, or Scranton, it's a little bit different there. That's all I'm going to say. They charge a little bit different on their on the transfer tax. So making sure your sellers and your buyers are aware of that. Again, time is of the essence. Making sure everything has to be done on or before that date. And if it's not, again, you're going to be out of time for that. Zoning. So like I said, there's 72 different zoning ordinances for York County and 34 in Adams County. Certain things like pre-existing nonconformities, I think, are a big issue. Actually, tonight I'll be at York Township and they're considering a rezoning request for a portion of their township. So everybody should be familiar, hopefully, with pre-existing nonconformities, but what that is. Let's say, and again, a good example is in York Township, as you are driving past York Tech on your left, going down like towards Dallastown and Handles. Kind of know, as you're going off to the left and right, there's little homes there. They look like homes, some of them are apartment rentals, but then some of them have signs out front for beauty salons or an appraiser. I know him personally, who has an office a little bit farther up the road. A lot of insurance companies, so I think an engineer also has a building there. But what happened was, at a time not too long ago, back when that wasn't as developed, those used to be just residences, large farm tracts and things like that. As it developed out, though, the township said, wait, because we're right off of 83, we're right on Queen Street, we should really try to focus this as more like a commercial office, more of an intensive use, and that way we can focus less intensive uses outside of that area. So what they do is they change the zoning, and they say no longer is this residential, this is now going to be commercial office. But they don't go up to Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who've lived in there since, the 1900s, and say, hey, you guys now have to either open up a business or you're gonna have to move. It's one or the other. No, they say you're allowed to continue to occupy, provided you don't do any of the following, right? You're not allowed to increase your building footprint by more than 25%. So you can add an addition, you can add some impervious surface, but you can't add anything other than that. And if you do, you have to build a conforming structure. So in that case, they'll say, don't add any more, or you'll have to tear this down and actually build some type of commercial use, right? They'll also say, look, you can sell it to the next person. You can sell it as long as they're going to occupy it as that residential use. And what they'll also do, and this is where you guys can kind of add some benefit on that, it can be abandoned. So if I had it as a commercial, or let's say it as a residence, and it's now sat vacant for 4 or 5 years, and I'm not in the process of marketing it for anything, they could say you have now abandoned that pre-existing non-conforming use and you're no longer allowed to continue. So these are all things. Now, if the way that you get involved, if you have a listing and you have showed interest in marketing it for that use, you actually get credit. There's a court case that allowed them to do that. So it basically says, hey, look, I tried to market it for that. If you take the reverse, you have a commercial structure that's now zoned residential. As long as you're trying to market it for those commercial purposes, you get credit for that time. But be very careful, because again, you could have somebody moving in here. Hey, can I put a pool in? Oh yeah, we'll put a pool in, we'll put a deck on. You can't actually, because it's a pre-existing non-conformity, okay? Fixtures and personal property, that's where we go into that. They did make some changes. So they did talk about, like I said before, items that are hardwired in. So anything, television mounting brackets, all of those other items are supposed to go. Anything else that are supposed to go with the property and stay there. And then anything that the seller wants to take out, make sure that they're doing that under the excluded items. As I tell everybody, just because it's in the listing, just because it's in the MLS, does not mean that it transfers over to your agreement of sale. So MLS is not an agreement between the parties. That's an invitation for people to make offers. Now, I will say it is a contract between brokerages, so cooperating brokers. So if I make an offer of compensation in the listing, and then I try to back out of that other broker, as long as we've gone to settlement and everything's going smoothly, the broker can then say, hey, wait, I'm going to arbitration because you offered this, I completed that part of that, and now you're trying to not pay me that amount. But again, there's no contract created between a buyer and seller as it relates to the MLS or as it relates to a listing. Yes.
Is it okay to write in there what's included as written in the MLS?
You can. I think that it might make more sense just to actually print it out,
Okay.
unless it's like a laundry list, and then you could just say as depicted in the MLS. I think that does cover you.
Okay.
Does it avoid confusion? I don't know, and then you might be back in the.
Probably not,
Yeah.
but I've
I'll
seen.
just delete all of it to the MLS then.
What's that?
I'll just delete it all out of the MLS then.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, modify the listing.
But you think
Yeah,
you're smart
yeah.
to print out the MLS and have everybody
Not
sign
if
it.
you have
It's
someone
contract.
sign the MLS.
Exactly, yeah, and you could attach it as a copy, and especially if it's a lot of stuff, or there's certain like exclusions or whatever, that might make sense, but otherwise, I'd just make sure to write it in at a minimum. I can't tell you how often, and I mean, these are very well-respected agents, but how often that happens, or like, crap, I missed it. I was supposed to exclude, some giant item that's physically attached to the wall that they were gonna take out and patch up, and it didn't, and now they're in this whole bickering match. I also had one where people went out literally to help stage the home. They go out and they buy a shed, right? And they put all their excess property in there at the encouragement of the agent. And then it was in the MLS, and their agent never took care to carry it over to the agreement of sale. And as you can see, storage sheds stay with the property. So couldn't take that, and that was quite a substantial investment. Thankfully, it was like one of the Home Depot ones that just dropped off, but no small investment items. But again, it has to be carried over. Just remember to take your time on these. I would say, again, it comes down to two things on the hotline: communication and agents not, I don't want to say not taking their time. I think a lot of times it's not being able to take your time, given the rush. But like I said, hopefully as things kind of, unfortunately slow down, now's the time to really refine their skills and their tools.
Didn't something just change with hot tubs?
That I don't know. There was no change that I saw that was made, but I can double check because they did come out back in July when they put out a whole bunch of them. There were a whole bunch of those changes, but I think it was only for this. I'm assuming it's dealing with all of the pumps and the things connected with it, and like the treatment things, but I'm not aware of any changes specifically. So I'll look into it. Good question. FHA, make sure you guys are filling this out. If it is truly an FHA deal, that's the mandatory clause. I always talk about that in my new member orientation. That is one of the non-waivable provisions.
I have a
So
quick question about that.
sure, go ahead.
The very first sentence
Yep.
of that box, it says, it is expressly agreed upon or agreed that notwithstanding any other provision of this contract, buyer will not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property described herein, or to incur any penalties by forfeiture of earnings, money deposit, or otherwise, unless buyer has been given in accordance with HUD, FHA, or VA requirements, a written statement by the federal housing, blah, 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 set forth the appraised value of the property of not less than blank. So I got in an argument with someone the other day about this. They were saying that because it was a new deal, it was FHA, but because the appraisal had not been done yet, they were arguing that they could get out of the deal free and clear.
Yeah, you have to have the appraisal. Well, I guess on this alone, no. On the appraisal FHA contingency alone, they could not get out of the deal unless they've had the appraisal completed and it's back to them. If that makes sense.
No, it does. Because
I'm assuming that was the basis.
It didn't make sense to me, but they were implying, but the way that very first sentence in that box is written, that because they did not have an appraisal done and they don't have the appraisal amount back yet, that they could back out of the contract because it says that they're not obligated to complete the purchase until they have that.
Yeah, I think that's an incorrect interpretation. This is just saying that notwithstanding any other provision, I guess a good way of saying I would agree with your interpretation.
Did you let them know?
I told them to get rocks.
I mean, and that's the other thing. There is a buyer, under the buyer financing, they have an obligation to complete that. They have an obligation to get the appraisal. And if not, I memean, I think at the end of the day, potentially they'll be in default. And you could say, hey.
I just never heard of that before. For someone to try and bring that up, I'm like, I'm like.
It's an interesting argument. I mean, I could kind of see where they're going with it, but that's that's not going to suffice, I don't think, in a court of law, because it's all predicated on your compliance with the other provisions of the Fair Rent Buyer.
That's right, some of it, right?
Yep.
I'll give like a 10,000 deposit on every FHA offer from now on.
There you go. Yeah.
If you can't take it.
The main thing again, and this is the point I have to change, the buyer may elect to make this agreement contingent upon mortgage finance. Regardless of any contingency elected though, if buyer chooses to obtain financing, the following will apply. So that again is to clear up that confusion of, hey, I waived financing, but now I have somebody knocking on my door asking to complete an appraisal. So that's what they're saying. Hey, I agree to waive it, but the buyer has to still provide, good information and things like that. Within 7 days, they have to have applied and completed the mortgage app. They're going to provide their access. The seller will provide access as required. And if the mortgage lender gives the buyer the right to lock in, they're going to do that at least 15 days before settlement. So all of these still apply, whether or not you have waived or elected the mortgage contingency as it relates to that. Here, under F, that's where you're actually going to make the selection. Am I going to waive it or am I going to elect it? Okay. So what they were trying to do, like I said, regardless of waiving or electing, these can still apply because there's nothing you really have to fill in here other than the timeline if you're going to do that. You could fill this in again if it's for an FHA deal. That would hopefully tip someone's hat that that's what's going on. And then you have the mortgage contingency and everything else. So keep in mind that if you haven't elected that in your contract, but you still apply for the FHA financing, it would be my opinion, you would not be entitled to a refund of your deposit, okay? Because you have not selected, a seller has not signed off on this amendatory clause, if that hasn't been completed, right? Now, if you do throw that in there, if you do throw that in, there, then that's fine. And I think you're then protected because you haven't completed a mandatory clause. But if you leave that blank, right? Okay, now there's no indication that that's what's going on. I think you would likely have an ability to argue as a seller that no, I think I get to keep that deposit because you can select that, and I have nothing signed by the bank that would basically say that I'm agreeing to that amendment. I don't know, and again, that hasn't really been litigated, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to how much amount of a deposit is the seller going to be fighting over in order to make that legal argument. So you have your amount of the first mortgage, amount of the second mortgage, make sure you're not filling, or make sure you are filling that in. One thing with a mortgage lender, I've seen it done less and less, thankfully. Be careful if you're gonna say like People's Bank for 4.5% or whatever it is, because if it turns out that like Traditions Bank is running a special that week or whatever, and they can get a lower interest rate, the fact that you have selected your lender now actually requires a seller's approval to get that changed, right? So always include, I think it's or other qualified lender, right? And that way it gives you a little bit of flexibility because you can work around that. So or other qualified lender, or reputable lender, something like that, if they're a little uneasy about qualifying. So what's that? Local, reputable local lender, yes. So, but that hopefully it still gives them some comfort. You're not gonna just go with something else. Yes, sir.
So question always comes up with loan to value. If you have a loan to value percentage in there, does that act as a appraisal contingency? Because if it appraises short and it's a 95% filled in there, yes or no, as far as arguable?
So it's a good question. Will you able to will you be able to get a loan based on the terms you selected in the contract? No. Does that give your buyer a right to terminate the contract? No. Your buyer is still going to have to continue to apply. So that's the risk they run. The appraisal contingency gives you the automatic out. House did not appraise, therefore I'm out, or whatever the case is. If you build in and just say, well, we'll get the back door, you're going to have to, let's say you get that back relatively quickly, and you don't have a commitment date until a month from now, you're going to have to demonstrate your good faith efforts of going around to other banks and applying, potentially damaging your credit so that you can hopefully get your deposit back based on that built-in contingency. So yes, it does provide you a little bit of comfort, I think, but at the end of the day, you're not in the driver's seat. And if the seller really wants to kind of push it to you, not only could they make you do that, but now, you know, they're going to say, well, we don't think you complied with that. It gives more room for interpretation on the default. So good question.
So you're saying that would fall then on the commitment date, and you have to prove in the time between that you're doing your due diligence if you just use the LTV.
Yeah, so and honestly, it's not even the commitment date because it's up to the seller to say, I'm done with that. It could actually be up to the settlement date. I mean, if you think about it, because this says that up to the commitment date or until the seller terminates,
Because
right?
the buyer has no right to terminate.
Correct, under financing contingency. So if I'm a disgruntled seller and I think I've been bamboozled, then I'm just gonna say, no, I'm not gonna give you back your deposit. And let's say we bump settlement out to like the end of January. I'm gonna hold on to your deposit money, and now you're gonna have to continue to do that, or you risk.
Because the
exposure.
sellers usually just want to get up back on the market, so we don't deal with this. But you're
Correct.
saying it could.
But they
Yeah, it
they
could. Yeah, and I've had, especially in like estate situations or something like that, where it's been on the market a long time, where the people have fought, and you know, you're not getting a lot of activity. At that point, they're upset.
So the question does come, what happens when settlement date comes and they weren't able to get financing and the settlement date comes and goes?
So that's a good question. So at that point, as long as you have no written extension, and you're not discussing it actively with between the buyer and the seller, the contract itself is over. So the seller could relist it, they could enter into a new contract. Now, your entitlement to deposit money has not been determined yet. So that kind of kicks back to the default provision. You now have, again, a disgruntled seller who can hold on if you haven't changed the agreement for up to 6 months after closing without agreeing to give you back your deposit, unless you're going to take action as a buyer to do that. So that's what I always say is like a good way to think about it. Agreement is done, but entitlement to deposit is still being figured out. Just be very careful, because sometimes there have been cases where like the buyer then gets disgruntled and they'll file what's called a lis pendens against your property, and then now you can't sell it, and there's this whole other legal issue that goes along with that.
Now,
So just have to be careful how you apply that.
in that situation, if you apply for an extension and the seller denies you of the extension, then what about the deposit?
I think it would, well, most likely, as long as the buyer, then I guess I didn't close that loop. As in that case, as long as the buyer can demonstrate they've done what they needed to do, I think the buyer still gets it back. The problem becomes the burden is on them to demonstrate all of that. And again, the seller, just for being a jerk maybe, or for other reasons, just can say, no, I'm not gonna agree, and you have to take me to mediation, or we're gonna wait that entire 180 days or whatever time period you have. So, yep.
For
Yes.
the home equity line of credit, that's what I'm dealing with right now. And we just added an addendum. We said for like the bank and stuff, but that's done cash basically, right?
What do you mean with a home equity line? So you're getting a first mortgage and then you're doing a HELOC after it, or?
No, we're getting the HELOC now.
Okay,
We're using proof of funds from his stock investment.
gotcha.
So we're just trying to put that all together.
So then you're gonna use the HELOC, I'm assuming on another property to buy the one that
His
he's getting?
personal property to buy the other property.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, as long as it's documented, I don't know how
Do
you
you have to
would,
fill that spot out?
I assume it would be, are they gonna be taking the mortgage position? Normally, if it's a home equity line, they're gonna have a mortgage or something in place, so that would be, if that's the only mortgage, that's what you would fill in for your first mortgage lien. If they are getting some other type of financing, like an actual traditional mortgage, that would then fall under your second mortgage, if they're gonna take a lien position on that property. Yep. Good question. Anybody else? So the financing contingency, as I said, buyer has absolutely no right to terminate under that. And in fact, if the buyer doesn't continue to demonstrate that they've undertaken those good faith efforts, they're not only not gonna get the home, they're not gonna get their deposit. Also have the change in buyer's financial status. So anytime that happens, make sure you're communicating that. I know it's a very difficult conversation to have with your buyers, like, hey, I know, it sucks, you just lost your job, but not only did you lose your job, but now we have to communicate that to everybody in the transaction to make sure that we comply with this provision of the contract, okay? So very difficult conversation. I have the utmost faith in you handling that, but at the end of the day, just make sure you're staying on top of that. Sometimes the stuff does slip through the cracks. And then you get into an issue of, well, how, promptly notify. What does that mean? I lost my job on Friday, they walked me out, and then I waited until Monday to tell you. Was that a prompt notification, or were you expecting notification over the weekend? And now, again, if you have a seller who is at all difficult, you might have room for interpretation or argument there. They're gonna say, well, I don't think it was prompt. So, again, stay on top, make sure, again, difficult conversation, but one that needs to happen. Selling public water and sewer. So again, with all of the new development that's going on, be very cognizant for new development, tapping fees, connection fees, and things like that. I'm a municipal attorney as well. So when you go to buy a lot, now again, a lot of the more seasoned developers, they have a lot of this stuff all hammered out. It's in their fee schedule, it's in all their costs and explanation. Sometimes though, if you're just buying a lot from like a developer who has one and they're going to build a house there, you may not know that, yes, there is public water and sewer, but the municipality, whomever servicing that, they charge you to actually tap into the line. So that is a physical, we are going to tap into your line and you have to pay for that to happen. And the way they calculate that, they have to do these fee studies. And the way they do that is they look at all of the improvements that were made to their sewer system within a certain number of years. And they find out the dollar value of those improvements, and they divide it over the number of new users on the system that they were able to add as a result of those improvements. So if you have a stormwater authority or a sewer authority that has just added a $34 million expansion to their plan, you can imagine tapping fees, depending on the amount of users they're going to connect, probably going to be about $15,000 to $20,000. Okay, so all of that gets passed through. That's just to tap into it. So you just punch the hole. Now you actually need to connect a pipe to it and run that pipe into your house. Now you have to pay what's called a connection fee. Again, that doesn't get paid to your plumber. That doesn't get paid to anybody else other than the municipality or the authority, that entity. They connect to the line, and now you have to pay your contractor or your plumber to run the line the rest of the way and then connect it into your home. So right off the bat, if you're looking at like 15 grand, normally you can divide it by half, and that's what your tapping fee is going to be, but they vary depending on municipality. And then once you look at that, now what are you going to have to pay your plumber or somebody else to come out and actually dig that line? So it's a lot of expense. Make sure you're looking at that. Like I said, a lot of developers, they can take on that cost because they're adding on a substantial amount. So they'll pay the dollar value to the municipal authority who's servicing it. And then they'll basically have reserved all of that, the tapping fee and everything else that goes with it. But again, sometimes you're just selling one lot, or sometimes it's maybe two lots or a smaller development. And the developer might not have the capacity to have done that in advance. The clients are aware of that. The main thing is that it just has to be disclosed. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Peter, and don't forget, like if you're in Dallastown, and like the area has been approved for sewer, but your current seller never tapped into it, that might be passed on to the buyer and they might have no choice, but they might get stuck with it.
And that gets into the notices, which we'll talk about. That's actually coming up next. Dallastown has an area called Colonial Heights, if anybody's familiar. It's right on the border with York Township. So half of the town of the development is in York Township, half of it is in Dallastown Borough. Dallastown Borough has what's called an Act 537 plan, as every single municipality in the county of York has. And that is, Act 537 is sanitary sewer infiltration and inflow. So what Act 537 does is that they say, if you have systems, now parts of Colonial Heights have cesspits. Anybody knows what those are? That's basically concrete blocks that have been dropped down that just drain sewage, human raw sewage down into the ground and allow the environment to do what the environment does. So when these things fail and it starts leaching out into creeks or rivers like that, what happens is the DEP comes in and they say, no more. If I come in and I have a failing system, I can't just apply to fix it. I have to apply now and then connect to public sewer. So the borough is in the process of undertaking this gigantic project to connect them to their public sewer line. The problem is, unfortunately, and again, there's allegations, if anybody lives there, I'm not trying to speak out of course or anything, but there's this big allegation, like a conspiracy, because only the Dallastown Borough residents are the ones that we have identified with the cesspits. Everybody else in York Township, nobody else we can link there. And again, my office actually represents the borough and the township, but honestly, all of the failing systems, when we go down, they actually have septic systems. So it makes it very difficult because now we're telling all the Dallastown Borough residents, you have to connect to public sewer, but all the York Township can go in and walk out with their permit and then fix their sewer. So very kind of up in the air, but what's happening, we have delayed this project on behalf of the borough since, I mean, God, it's been almost 10 years now. We just kept going to the DEP saying, please, can you give us more time? We're gonna work it out. So we've been able to defray that, which at the time, to anybody, any taxpayer, that's a great thing, right? We don't have to pay for this, but what are you doing? You are delaying the inevitable. And not only that, but you've now taken a project when we quoted it out at about $4 or $5 million, and you delayed 10 years. So what do you think that does to your cost? We're now up to like 15, 20 million. So all of that is being taken into consideration. But what happened 10 years ago, property owners in that development are getting notices. And they're saying, hey, by the way, you're gonna have to connect to the sewer, and these are the anticipated costs.
Or they're not.
Correct. Now, what do they do? What does the seller do when you get that?
They throw it away.
Oh, I never even got anything from that. And they'll never be able to
Don't
prove this, that, or the other. So then you have a buyer who then buys in that area. And then they get notice from their neighbor or whomever else and say, hey, you gotta come to the borough meeting because they're gonna make us all pay X number of dollars to connect to their system. Wait, seller never told me that, seller never did. So, you know, the sewer systems, I think, are more of a longer term thing. The main thing for notices from municipalities are really sidewalks and curbing, because those projects are ongoing constantly. And sidewalks and curbing is a pass through on to the property owner who's directly connected to that sidewalk or has the benefit of it. So that can be an exorbitant cost, and we had the same issue in Dallastown as well, where owners were selling property after having received this notice that, hey, you owe us like $1,200 to fix this, just not letting anybody know, and then they sold it, and now the new buyer gets the notice, and now they're stuck with the bill. So there is a provision in the contract, if you do get that notice, you have to provide it on, and if you don't, technically they're going to be on the hook for that. And I know because there was a mediation case that occurred from a Dallastown Borough case just like that. And that was the whole claim. Look, you got the notice, the borough demonstrated you got the notice, and you have to pay for that notice. So, any questions?
Is there liability for us as agents? Like if in general, we know that Dallastown has this headache, can that ever come back on us?
Not general. I mean, I think you're
No,
be
but
doing
they
a
make
great
a lot of
service.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd be doing a great service to your client by letting them know.
Like how do I know?
But
if
as a seller agent,
is-
yeah, it's tough. Where does that duty lie? But I mean, the hard fact is, unless you have received it yourself or you're required to fill out a disclosure, all you can do is encourage your client to do what they should do legally. And if they don't, what I would want to do is go and talk to your broker so that they can document it accordingly, that you came and talked to them. Maybe they have some different ideas of addressing it, or just maybe applying some pressure
You
because.
see that more in between the parties. as
Yeah.
opposed to-
Yeah, and I mean, I get it. It's for the stormwater, where if you got a notice and then what are you gonna do? Hold an escrow money for 10 years where we're now finally gonna spend it? Like that doesn't, but like for curb and sidewalk, that's a benefit. Now, again, there's an argument that as the owner, I don't have any of the benefit of the new sidewalk. So why would I, as that seller, have to pay for that when you as the buyer are gonna get the complete benefit? But the whole point is it should open the course for that negotiation or discussion to happen. It shouldn't be something that's kept silent. Correct. So that turns into another issue. But, Pennsylvania Sewage Facilities Act, that has to be a disclosure filled out anytime you are selling any type of vacant land. So this will let everybody know, hey, is it perfectly probed? Do I have a well yield? A lot of calls on the hotline, especially back when you weren't seeing inspections, people were waiving inspections for like wells. So they bought a home from grandma and grandpa who lived out on the farm and just the two of them and rarely had any visitors. And now a family of 7 from the Philly suburbs has moved in and the well runs dry when they run a load of laundry and 2 kids take a bath. And that's one thing. It's like, well, again, that should be something that is disclosed, but a well yield test, obviously inspections like that fall back on the buyer. So this is just saying what type of system do you have? I would say for the vast majority of improvement, it's going to be the public sewer. Very rarely do you have a community sewage disposal system, although again, not throwing it out there. Normally, if you're going to have an all-not septic system, it's going to be individual all-not sewage disposal system, sewage notice 1. So that is one where there's no existing community sewage system available for the subject property. This is just, I have on-lot septic or whatever the case is. They actually do have. There's not available. I have an individual system, a holding tank. Holding tank is just another a nicer version of a cesspit that actually is contained. And then if there's permit limitations, because you're not allowed to have that, that again needs to be disclosed. Another thing that was happening frequently back a little bit before this, 2004 and 5, is that areas of property that were vacant were being sold. But what was happening was the municipality had actually issued a moratorium on the issuance of any sewage permit. So somebody would buy this lot, they'd go out and apply, and then the township would say, oh, you can't do that. We have a moratorium for 5 years. And they're thinking, well, how am I going to have a builder in here by this time? How are we going to do this? So now they're trying to make sure that that is an actual disclosure. And this is a non-waivable provision. So what I mean by that is that the seller has incorrectly filled this out, even innocent. That is a contingency that the buyer can use to get out of the contract, even up to the day of settlement. Okay, so very important to have this thing filled out. Like I said, 9 times out of 10 it's public sewer. If not, make sure you're asking the questions that have to do with it. Any land use restrictions? So if there's ag security, Farmland and Forest Land Assessment Act. Everybody familiar with clean and green? So it has to be a minimum of 10 acres or something less than 10 acres that is producing at least $2,000 of yearly gross revenue. And I'll say anticipated yearly gross revenue because we all know the Christmas tree farms, right? If you plant a Christmas tree today, it's not going to grow until probably 8 years, but it has anticipated gross revenue of $2,000 or more. So guess what? If I go out and I buy an acre or 2, and again, you have to look at the values of those trees. You clear everything and you plant Christmas trees, as long as you can demonstrate based on the amount of trees that you planted, the average yield, you know, you're going to lose some, but as long as you can show you're going to have at least $2,000 of yearly gross revenue, that is entitled to clean and green value. So clean and green value is a way to incentivize the preservation of ag land. Farmland is another way to think of it. Forest reserve, so large areas of timber land. So not just kind of you know, swampy areas that have a lot of overgrowth. This is actually like harvestable timber. You're supposed to have to demonstrate, and again, we're not sending an assessment officer out to like actually take a tape measure around to find out what the circumference is or anything like that, but it's supposed to at least meet that minimum threshold. Be very careful when you're buying into developments and they say, don't worry, we've made the lot 10 acres so you can apply for clean and green. Unless that owner is going to open it up for open space. Open space means they have to open their property up during reasonable hours and reasonable times. They can set some limitations. They're not going to qualify for clean and green because they're not producing an agricultural commodity. There's no forest land. All they are is over 10 acres. So the way they could qualify would be what's called open reserve. But like I said, that involves you're going to have hikers potentially coming out to your property during reasonable hours that may not suit somebody who has the money to buy a 10-acre tract and build a large home. So just be aware of that. I represent the assessment office, which is why I kind of have a lot of knowledge about that useless topic. But at the end of the day, very important, I think, to be looking at that. Restrictions on land use restrictions or notices regarding those land use restrictions. So the Right to Farm Act, very plainly put, if you buy property by a farm, you are going to see, smell, and hear things that you don't hear, see, or smell outside of a farm setting, right? So be aware of that. So don't buy that, you know, the cute little farmette and then complain every time they put down in the pasture, any type of manure or fertilizer, right? You have to be aware that Pennsylvania has passed an act that says the farmers have a right to continue to do that. Talked a little bit about the Clean and Green Program, the Open Space Act, the Real Estate Sellers Disclosure Act. We can talk about that in as much detail as you want, but main thing is you all have liability as agents. You have to do two things: provide a blank copy to the seller at the time you do your listing agreement. You have to also tell them they have an obligation to fill it out accurately and completely. If you don't do that, you're all on the hook for 2 years after closing, okay? So that's for a material defect. I always tell the story where the individual disclosed on the seller's disclosure that there was central heating, central air in all parts of the home. Buyer never does an inspection, never does a walkthrough, they buy the home. Guess what's missing from the home? HVAC system. Do you know what the cost to cure that failure to disclose is? You have to install an HVAC system. That's what the court said. So again, be very careful on those disclosures. Go ahead.
So I have really dense sellers sometimes where I tell them like, look, you have to fill out everything.
Yep.
Like it says at the top, it's you have public water, so that means no for everything else. They give it back to me, it's not filled out. I'm like, seller, you missed it. You gotta do it again. They give it back to me, it's not filled out. Like how many times do I have to go to these people?
So there's
Seller shield.
Seller
It's so
shield,
annoying.
right, yeah.
Seller
There's a
shield.
program you can use that prompts them, so they can't
It's
physically complete
online.
the form.
They can't skip anything.
Yeah, and they
It's
have to do
free.
that. The other thing is it's a broker question.
Yeah.
But the way I always push that is unless you have filled this thing out, you are gonna be exposed to liability. So please just make sure when you're filling this out, every single thing, and unfortunately, it may come down to some handholding where you have to say, hey, I noticed paragraph or lines, 404, 407, 909 are missing these things. You have to go back and complete those, but
yeah,
you have done, it sounds like what you're legally required and fiduciarily required to do. It's just providing that extra benefit of the service to the client to protect.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. I know.
Yeah, it's like,
It's a lot of
it
hand.
gets to a point where you're like, I don't want you to think I think you're stupid.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, like.
You're demonstrating that quality.
Yeah. It's like,
Yeah,
I'm-
no, I get it. Yep.
I had some very elderly clients, like upper 90s, like getting ready to celebrate 100. And he was like, I'll just tell you, you fill it out. And I know, like, I was like, I can't. Like,
Correct.
I was like, I can take notes for you and give them back to you and you can fill it out. But I can't. And we went back and forth. Like, he was really mad at me,
Mhm.
but I didn't.
Yeah, so find somebody from their church, like that's what I always recommend is if you can sit down with somebody from their church or from their community group or from, if they go to like a center or a senior center or something like that, that's always very beneficial. Doctors, somebody,
So I got his daughter to do it.
Yeah.
She walked through the house and did it,
Perfect.
and then they were wrong. Like, I knew the
Not
hot water heater in the house was gas, not electric, so I was like, okay, well, now it's not even right.
Right, yeah.
Like, it was
But it's
just
not
like.
your problem.
Yeah, and that's the tough part is that you can try to say, hey, based on my inspection, it's this, but I'll defer to you because you're the one making this representation. But yeah, that's a big thing, and not to dovetail too far onto the senior side, but that we get a lot of calls and questions on that, and actually some ethics hearings that come about with capacity and how do you judge? In your case, if you're dealing with a senior citizen who is habitually sending stuff back incomplete, does it get to a point where you're kind of like, does this person really get what's going on? And am I communicating with them, in a way that they can understand, because they might not be able to do that. So that's a definite point where you want to get your broker involved. We had an ethics situation where an individual representing an elderly person had them under contract, under an agreement of sale. And it turns out a family member gets involved, and then they find out that the person has dementia. And because they have dementia, there's no power of attorney. So the only way that they can get this person who has no capacity to act, they have to go through a guardianship. So depending on where you are, this person happened to be located out towards Philadelphia. It could be months before that happens. So you're now this buyer, all they want is their deposit back because they can't go to closing, but there's legally nobody who can sign on behalf of the seller to give back the deposit because nobody has capacity for that person, either as a POA or as their guardian yet. So again, it's very important to kind of go through that process. Always remember, do your homework and get your documents, okay? If someone says, I'm the POA for my mom, I'll send it to you later, whatever the case is, make sure you get a copy, okay? And if they give you grief, like, well, it's important, I don't know, you're gonna have to get it recorded, right? If it's a seller, most likely that person's gonna sign the deed, so you're gonna have to get it recorded. So let's get it in advance, we'll get it to the title company, and that way everything's out of control. But there were so many times I received calls where an agent said, look, I got a call from a guy I went to high school with. He was a really good guy. His mom, is going into a home and he's acting on her behalf. I signed a listing agreement with him. We're doing this. We get an offer and I go and I take it to them. And then all of a sudden I get a call from the sister. And it turns out the brother really is somewhat estranged from the family now. And the sister is actually the POA. And guess what? It gets better. The sister is best friends with another agent who's at a different brokerage. And they've now signed a listing agreement, a valid listing agreement with that other owner or that other, agent. So, and legally, you have no ability to go back. You have a listing agreement with somebody who doesn't own the property. So even though you've marketed it, heaven forbid, you've gone out and taken photos, you've done all this other stuff, you've negotiated an offer. You're not getting compensated. And now you have a buyer who thinks they might be in an offer. Hopefully you didn't get that far, but that could be just a whole cluster. Yes, go ahead.
With the power of attorney, can't the person who has the power of attorney still sign?
They can. So what do you mean? If they show up at
So
closing?
you have a power of attorney,
Yep,
but you also have somebody who is capable of signing.
right. It's really up to them.
Not
what they
every
want to
power of
use.
attorney is a situation where one is incapacitated and can't sign.
Correct.
In that case, both are valid though, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, technically the POA signature would be valid up until it's been revoked potentially. But in this case, the brother, he's not.
This is,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was
Oh,
talking
you're
about my
talking about here. Gotcha.
situation, where it was
Okay.
almost like a tennis match, like one day one guy was signing, someday the
Yeah.
other person was signing, but one was a power of attorney
Yeah.
and one was the actual person who had
The
the power
principal,
of
yeah,
attorney.
who gave it,
Principal.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's fine. That's
And both
perfectly
are
acceptable.
acceptable.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, now the only time it comes into question would be if the principal is starting to show evidence of some type of.
And that would have to come from a third
That's
party of
right,
some
yeah.
sort.
That, and don't think for a second, I'm asking you guys to make that determination. That should just be a wait. I need to now have potentially a conversation because I'm not getting that warm and fuzzy.
So we shouldn't act like doctors?
No, you can be attorneys, just not doctors, all right? Yeah, there's a little bit different, but yeah, the main thing is that the POA expires as of date of death. So if the principal dies, the POA, all the power that agent has, that think of that dies as well. So, and the POA, the agent, is not always necessarily the person that has been named in the will. Hopefully there is a will, because if not, now you're gonna have to probate, go to the register of wills and ask for somebody to be appointed. And if the person has all sorts of children or other heirs, now you're gonna have to get what's called renunciations from all of those other beneficiaries saying, yes, I consent to this person being. So you have now taken a situation that's like, oh, okay, we can kind of deal with it, to this is gonna involve a lot of man hours, a lot of work, and a lot of involvement actually from legal counsel to get that resolved, okay? So just be aware of that. The other kind of thing to talk about is what happens when, let's say you have a listing, you have an agreement of sale and you signed it, and now the seller dies during that time period, okay? So you're under an agreement of sale, but the one who has the ability to sign has now passed away. What do? So first call will be hopefully to the other broker and let them know. Likely, now the kind of the tricky part is the contract is binding on heirs, successors, and sons. So your estate still has an obligation to follow through with that, theoretically. The other problem becomes you can't automatically, in your county, we're beneficial in being able to do that. But if you're in a large county, it's going to be hard to get an appointment before the register of wills and take out letters of administration. Like I said, assuming everything is in order and you have a will and you have all those other things. So very first thing, obviously send your condolences. I'm not trying to be inhuman or anything, but then find out, hey, did they have a will? What is the intent of the estate? Are they still interested in following up here? And kind of impress upon them, hey, you're under contract. We have some timelines. I'll reach out to the other agent, but technically it's still binding on that estate. Okay. So I would probably amend your listing agreement too, because you'll have a different signer potentially on all the documents. And that way it's kind of a clear file. But it happens. Actually, that was one of my first or second days of the job. I remember we were supposed to have a settlement at Stock and Leader, and the individual, I think it was the son, went to pick up dad to drive him to our office.
Oh, no.
And dad had passed away that night. And it was like, I think it was cousins, I think, were buying it. So everybody was on the same page. It was like an actually, farm credit loan. So it was a little bit easier to deal with, but it does happen, unfortunately, but you just have to kind of think on your feet a little bit. Pick up the phone, call me on the hotline. That's what I'm here to help with. So let's see what else we got. So the land use restrictions, we talked about the real estate seller's disclosure law, public and or private assessment. So if there is any other type of condo, homeowners association, any other type of assessment that would be out there. So that's where you got your notice potentially, hey, we're gonna have to collect from you X number of dollars, that can be where that falls in there as a public assessment. For the highway occupancy permit, this is another mandatory contract provision, so it just says if you are buying a lot, access onto a road is not guaranteed. So if you have to carve out, that's gonna be requiring you to get a highway occupancy permit, deal with PennDOT, make sure your site distance is appropriate, that, you know, there's adequate turn areas and all those other items. Internet of Things, that was a rage a little bit ago, probably like 2018. But this is kind of like, don't be stupid, right? So hopefully everybody knows the story. It was out of Philadelphia, but the gentleman bought a home. It was not a very friendly settlement, rather contentious between the buyer and the seller. In the home were all sorts of like Nest doorbells, Nest thermostats and things like that. And sure enough, this spiteful, vengeful seller found out that after settlement, the buyer didn't change any of the login information. So once they do that, what do you think the seller does once he realizes, oh, I can get access into all these different places? So they go, all right, I'm gonna log in, and in the middle of a hot Philadelphia summer, I'm gonna turn the heat on to 80 degrees. So this guy comes home and is literally like, it's a sauna here, what's going on? And he checks it, he's like, all right, he sets it back, everything kind of cools down. He starts doing it over and over and over again. So he calls Nest, and Nest finds out there's all these logins, but they're coming from this different, you know, IP address, and sure enough, they link it back. So this is saying, really in a nutshell, like, sellers, don't be stupid. Make sure you're not doing that. Buyers also don't be stupid. Make sure you're changing the passwords and other items along that. So one reason I always bring this up is that there's a contract paragraph down here that says this paragraph will survive settlement. So there's a doctrine at law called merger. Okay, so what that means is that if you have an agreement of sale such as this, and then you buy a property, what do you get at the end of the day? Normally, you're going to get a deed, right? So you get that deed, you get it recorded, the property is now yours. The doctrine of merger says, regardless of all the agreements you had out there with the buyer and seller, unless it's referenced in the deed, everything has gone away, everything has merged into that, right? So in this case, all of this contract language where it says this paragraph will survive settlement, if that wasn't there, after closing, the seller could go back in and then log back in and do that other stuff. So what that provision is really meaning is that this must survive settlement, but just notice some of the other stuff that doesn't necessarily survive settlement. It's a lot of the representations that were made beforehand. So the reason you see that there is because this is actually saying, I will not do this after closing. Okay, that's why you have to have that contract language there in order to keep that binding and keep their feet to the fire. Due diligence, more and more, I think inspections are coming back. So again, be very careful, mindful of what you're electing, what you're waiving. The notices regarding the property environmental inspections, again, just kind of general disclosures, but always worth, I think, going over with your client just to make sure that you know there's certain stuff that they're going to look for. There's certain things that they obviously can't find. Going with your inspection contingencies, I already talked about buyers, informational purposes only, but just make sure you're hammering all that stuff out. Contingency period with the timing. So contingency period is 10 days from the date of the execution of the agreement of sale. What needs to happen? You have to have all your inspections performed. Once you have them performed, you also have to provide all the reports back to the seller in their entirety during that time frame. Okay. So I always get this question. Let's say you have a contingency period of 10 days. You buy or you get everything done on day 2 and you send a BRI day 3. Your contingency period doesn't end when you send the BRI. So you still have that full contingency period in order to work that out. And the reason for that is if you look, it says at the expiration, where is it? Piece 2. Following the end of the contingency period, buyer and seller will have 5 days for a negotiation period. All right. Now, I think I thought more attorneys on that than I have realtors or real estate agents. But at the end of the day, that's the way it plays out. You have that full 10 days. So if you have a buyer who has elected several inspections and they're going to be completed by different inspectors, you're getting different BRIs. The best thing, in my opinion, to do is just wait until the end of that contingency period, that 10 days. Then sit down, because it's kind of difficult, I think, having a conversation with the seller. There's kind of a sense of closure when you reply back and agree to it. And now it's like ripping a Band-Aid off again, like, oh, now they want $1,000 to do this, or they want to credit towards the squeaky doorknob or this, that, or the other. So wait till the end of that time period, then you enter your negotiation period. After negotiation is your 2-day time period, and that's where what I call the drop dead period. If you haven't heard back from seller, you haven't reached that mutually agreeable time period, make sure as a buyer agent, you are sending that termination notice within that 2 days. Okay, don't fall back on, oh, well, we were still negotiating, right? I thought you were gonna take it back to your seller to see if they were gonna do that, because at the very end, it says ongoing negotiations don't automatically extend that time. So once you're in that time period, that's it, then you have your 2 days and then you're out.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've personally done that before, like where I got an RTI back and I forgot they were getting like a water test done. And they send it back and like I negotiate the whole thing with my clients. And I'm like, oh shit, they're having a water inspection too.
And that's a tough conversation to have.
Because
That's
they're gonna get idiots.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they're like, oh, they can't do it. You're like, ah, wow. Yeah, go ahead.
Technically, since they have, say, 10 days, you get it back after 2, even though it's a reply to inspection to home and they ask for X amount, they could within that extra days come back and ask for additional.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So just because you accept that, that doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you agreed to change it and you have no finality in terms of that timeline. So you're still open. And then again, within the contingency period, they could say, oh, my last BRI after I've nickel and dimed the heck out of you and I got this, the last BRI is me terminating because I'm not satisfied with the condition of the property. As long as that's done by day 10, that's
Right.
technically done within the time frame. So very frustrating, but again, we'll see where the market goes with it.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Back to inspections, that's election of contingency for inspection. Now, if they waive contingency of inspection, do they still have the right to do inspection without a contingency?
So, my position would be no, in all circumstances other than a financing contingency or a financing election where they don't have a contingency maybe, but for FHA. So if I waive my inspection, but if it's an FHA deal or I elect to go with an FHA financing, even though I don't have that contingency, technically the inspection would still occur, but the seller would be under no obligation to agree to accept that. And if the buyer can't get the financing, the buyer still will lose their deposit. So
Because it would be on them because it was an
That's right.
FHA requirement.
that's right. And they haven't selected any inspection.
Any other
contingency as
inspection.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So you would have to allow them in. Likewise, now on a financing, say I've selected a financing contingency, the financing contingency for FHA would be subject to getting that satisfactory inspection. So if that goes through and it's not satisfactory, I've waived my inspection, but which is really hard to do because FHA is going to pick that up, your lender's going to pick that up. But let's say you've waived inspection, but you've elected FHA, inspection comes back and they say, we need to fix these, otherwise they're not going to get the loan, and you say no. I think then that falls back on, I'm unable to get this loan, I'll still apply, but hey, I have a financing contingency and I can technically get out if the seller terminates. Waiving financing, waiving inspection, I can still go through with my FHA, I'll follow through with that, have to have the inspection done, but if they want A, B, and C done, or they're not gonna get the loan, you can say no thanks, and I'll take your deposit because you have no option, so.
The argument came up on that somebody waived an inspection. They said they were waiving the contingency, not waiving the right to their inspection, just waiving the contingency, being that they still had 2 walkthroughs allowed. They wanted to bring an inspector along with the walkthroughs, which I pointed out they weren't allowed to because the walkthroughs were for buyers.
Correct, buyer's informational purposes only, and can only be attended by the buyer, the party and their agent.
Unless otherwise.
Unless otherwise agreed, yeah, which is another good point, because, and I know this has happened before, but let's say mom and dad are out of town, oh, hey, we'll drive our daughter or son or, son and daughter-in-law over. And now it's like, well, technically, you guys have to wait out here, or let me call up the agent really quickly and just say, hey, they want to come through because they're really excited. But then you have the flip side where dad's a contractor. Now all of a sudden, hey, did they look at this? And he's pulling up, and it's like, so how far do you really let that go? But that's the whole reason for that, is because it's not, and you should have heard the horror stories I was hearing during COVID, that's what people were doing, or they're during even an open house, they would try to bring an inspector in, but you are not, the seller has not permitted any type of an inspection of the home to occur. So the buyer's not just at liberty.
That was my understanding, but I had an agent argue with me on that, so.
That's always, so. You had a question?
Yeah, if you do have a seller, especially with rings and stuff now, and you do notice that a buyer is bringing mom and dad, what leverage do you have as a seller? Is that defaulting the?
Technically, I think if you want
Well,
to be.
especially if mom and dad cause an issue, I
Yes.
guess is what I'm alluding
That's
to.
what,
We
you
never
know,
gave them permission to
That's
be
right.
here, and now this is causing a huge issue. The seller could,
That's
That's
what
right.
PAR went through. We just went through this, 2 years ago?
Mhm.
like, especially
Yeah,
if they
it was
get cold
nightmare.
feet and want to leave.
Yep.
Well, mom and dad were there
They're not in the
now.
contract. They don't have any say.
Yeah, so if you're a seller and that becomes an issue, you could fight to keep that.
You could,
deposit?
yeah, theoretically, I think, yeah, and again, it comes back to how hard you want to push, because the contract can be over, but you can still be.
But you know
fighting
how
about those
dads
possible.
can be
Yeah,
sometimes.
that's
Oh,
why
I
it was
hear you.
changed.
And moms.
That's what I'm
too.
saying, if they try
That's why
to,
the part changed, yeah.
okay.
Right, yep.
Peter, how would this work?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. With the pest inspection in regards to financing, do you not have to elect the pest inspection? It would be covered under the financing?
So that's what I'm saying. Normally the lender, if they see that, they're going to say, we need something in writing that allows this inspection to occur.
Okay.
And that's why they're gonna push back. But I would say in the default, if you say, I'm not gonna allow you an inspection because you didn't elect it, but you have selected FHA financing, the buyer will be unable to get the loan. So as long as they've acted in good faith, what the seller is really doing is just kind of saying, okay, I'm terminating this contract and giving you back your deposit by not allowing you to have that inspection, or by refusing to do anything the inspection requires.
Okay.
So that's really, I think it comes in when you see somebody selecting that FHA and potentially you don't have an inspection, or they've selected the inspection to go along with it, just letting them know, look, I get it, you don't want to do anything to the property, but if you select that, they're not going to be able to get the loan and they'll get back their deposit money because of that.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Yep. Anybody else?
As a listing agent, how much responsibility do you have to stay on the buyer agent to meet the contingency period? Like my buyer is 2 days late and now they're coming back. And I'm like, sorry.
Liability, I don't know. And again, I don't think the seller can take you to court and say you didn't preserve your fiduciary duties by not staying on top of the buyer and the buyer's agent. But what I think could happen is that seller who's been miffed is gonna not speak very highly of you. And obviously, as you know, in your referral sources by word of mouth, that's where I think you're not really doing a great service for them by not pushing to get that done. But ethically, fiduciarily, I don't think you're violating anything by just kind of taking a hands-off approach. But I think you can provide more value to your client by being more actively involved to make sure that that stuff is happening. Not saying that you have to say buyer will agree to allow me to call their mortgage lender at all hours of the day and this, that, or the other, but at the same time, I think staying on top of it, making sure you're then communicating with your client where things are is definitely better.
Yeah, and the buyer agent just isn't responding. So I'm like, the inspection was due 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Do we have it? Do we not? Like, you're at a contingency at this point,
Right.
It's like that's on the buyer's agent, not on
Correct.
me.
Yeah, they're accepting it at that point. That's right. So that's the risk.
Writing.
Yep.
Well, that was my next question. Like, do I need to do a buyer's reply to inspection?
I'd at least text,
Just
I'd
send it
at
to
least
them.
email them and say, this expired 2 days ago and we're under the assumption that, your buyer is accepting it as.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, just to kind of move it along to see if you get a response. And then again, your sellers are the driver's seat at that point.
Yeah.
If they want to do something about it, but that is, again, the inspection timing is always one of the most confused. And I think it's just the fast paced nature of everything moving like that, but it becomes an issue. And again, this time is of the essence. So if you're a day late, you're not getting it. Notices, assessments, municipal requirements. So this is the no-brainer, but if you do a lot of improvements to your home, your taxes will increase. If you add an addition or you add a pool, although you ask the pool owner, they'll tell you that they're losing money hand over fist, your property value will go up. This doesn't really apply in tons of circumstances, but just be aware of that. So if you're buying a new build, they might prorate taxes based on the lot value of like 45,000, but then they're building a $500,000 home. The bank does not collect that as escrow. Okay, there's no bank that is willing to take that risk, of which I'm aware. There might be now, but every lender that we've ever worked with will say, we will give you an estimate of that, but when that tax bill comes out, that is on you as a buyer. So there's actually a law that was changed. It's Act 57 of 2022. It does impact you guys. Anybody, I think a few of you might have been at our realtor reception, so we talked about it there. There is an ability now for a property owner who will sign an attestation that they bought their property within the last year and did not receive a tax bill, whether it's an interim tax bill, an annual tax bill, or anything else like that, a real estate, school, county or local tax bill. If I didn't get that, I bought the home within a year and I'm willing to sign off on the attestation, I can only pay, as long as I'm paying it at that time, the face amount value of those taxes. So I could have been delinquent for 6 months, but I'm signing off because I never got the notice. And normally what happens is somebody buys the home in July, right? Tax bills are printed July 1st in the then owner's name. School district doesn't get notice of that until August, but the bills have already been sent out. So, the owner who's getting all their mail forwarded down to Sarasota or whatever, they're like, oh, York County, PA, well, I sold that property, they throw it out. No notice goes to the new owner, and now the new owner is like, well, I paid my taxes at closing, right? I don't have any other taxes due. And the next thing they get is a nice green, lime green sign on the front door saying that my office is going to be selling their property at the tax sale because they didn't pay their taxes, right? So what that tries to do is alleviate that. The problem becomes there's an obvious cost. Tax collectors, tax claim bureau, they're spending money to collect those delinquent taxes that we then have to write off. But at the end of the day, I won't woe you with that tale, because more importantly for your clients, there is a benefit there. So make sure you guys are aware of that. If you do get a call saying, hey, we bought the property in July, I never got the tax notice, that becomes effective for 2023 taxes going forward. So could be a valuable tool, especially on new homes. I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to. Condo planning community, very straightforward. The only thing I will say there, I get a lot of confusion. At the bedrock of agency law, you guys are your clients, right? So if you get a document on Friday at 4 o'clock, but you're out of the office, your client still got it at Friday at 4 o'clock because you are your client, right? You're their agent. So that applies to all documents except two, and those are the resale and plan public offering statements for condos and planned communities. So a lot of times what will happen is they'll send that to the title company. They send it to the attorney or to somebody else, to the real estate agent. And they'll say, you got those condo documents, so your timeline has started. It has to be in the hands of the buyer for that timeline to be clear. So just be very aware of that. Everything is online now, so hopefully it's streamed a little bit easier or more easily, and that way you can get like read receipts. But that was what scared me back when like the whole crazy market was going on. People were selling condos for all cash, no financing deals, no inspections. So you're like, oh, this is great. That's a no inspection deal. Those are non-waivable. Public offering, resale certificates is non-waivable. So until you can demonstrate that they have all that information and that 5 days has come and gone, they have an absolute right to get out of that contract. Okay. So just be aware of that, because again, it can kind of freak some people out when like, what do you mean it's not sold? Again, part of the planning community, it talks about the timeline that's stated therein, talks about how your real estate assessed values can change. Maintenance and risk of loss, who's responsible during that time period. So if you do have catastrophic loss, so let's say your basement floods after you're under an agreement of sale, a buyer and seller have an avenue to negotiate. Okay, and that's all set forward in there. The seller can say, I'm not fixing it. The seller can say, I'm going to give you cash credit, or the seller can say, I'll fix it in advance. Okay, and the buyer then says, I'm either okay with that or I'm not. This came up a little bit. It was like back October, I want to say 2 years ago, when we had all of that torrential downpour. A lot of people under contract right at the height of kind of 2020, 2021. And now all of a sudden, this has become a huge issue of like, well, wait, who has to fix that and how does that play out? It is in your contract, not always that easily rectifiable though. Talks about you're not allowed to record the contract. Pennsylvania law does apply. FERPA is becoming, I think, more and more of an issue, but that is anybody who is selling property. The buyer actually has a withholding obligation in that instance. So if you're selling to somebody who's labeled as a foreign person, so they're not either a US citizen, a resident, or a permanent resident, or anything like that, the buyer has an obligation to hold 15% of the amount that would be realized from the sale. That's why a lot of times you'll see the FERPA certificates, they'll see them signed at closing, I'm not a foreign national, here's my social security, whatever, because they're making sure, representing the buyer at closing, that we're not going to have this withholding obligation. But I think, and also just to kind of dovetail, we've seen an uptick in the scams with people, especially from China or Russia, who are trying to buy property sight unseen. They won't talk to you on Zoom, they won't call you on the phone, but they'll communicate via email. My office is actually in the process of trying to ferret out one of those right now. I will say the check cleared, so we haven't received any requests to be reimbursed any of those funds yet, but it's one of those things where it doesn't necessarily apply on that side because it's a buyer, but always, it's very difficult to say this without sounding a little insensitive, but be very cautious with foreign buyers or sellers, just from a practical perspective, because there are some additional tax requirement things that you're going to have to do for them. Okay, so not cautious in the sense that they're evil or wrongdoing, but cautious in the fact that, hey, I got to make sure my pencil is sharp in here because I have some additional things I need to do. Mainly, obviously, with Megan's law, you guys are not going to be required to do anything with that. It's up to them to make sure you're satisfied. And then, the buyer, and then paragraph 26, that's your default provision. Paragraph 26G, seller is limited to retaining those sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies as liquidated damages. That means if you don't receive a deposit and you check that box, the seller doesn't get anything. Okay, the seller can't even sue to get that. They have a defense counsel. They're very smart. They'll just say nope, doesn't apply. We keep that. Everybody has to mediate. I think we've already kind of talked about that, but that applies. Any type of dispute that arises from this.
Real quick question, you
Go ahead.
said it could be any third party.
So as
Did
long
I
as
hear
the
you say
parties
that?
agree,
Okay.
yes, as long as the parties agree and that the mediator agrees to abide by the rules and procedures that were set forth in the dispute resolution system.
Money sitting in the house, post 180 days, they didn't file for mediation. Does the seller have an option to get that?
Well, they could file for mediation now. So the way that time period plays out, the 180 days, if you provide notice as a buyer at the expiration of the 180 days, the listing agent most likely holding the deposit says, you're right, I don't have any notice of litigation, nothing's been started. They have 30 days from the date of receipt to provide it back. There's nothing the seller can do after the buyer has delivered that.
Now, if we pass that,
So if the buyer has not yet delivered the notice and you're past your 180 days, the seller can still initiate mediation and the listing agency cannot disperse that, even with the request from the buyer after that time period, if that makes sense. So as long as the buyer hasn't made the request at the expiration of the time frame, you'll have to continue.
but if
to
it
hold
sits there for 2 years,
Yep.
okay. So
Seller
the
can
seller
do it as
still
long as the
has
buyer-
to, seller still has to initiate.
Yep.
Okay,
That's right. And that's where we at RAYAC have tried to do a better job of, as soon as we get notice of an entitlement to deposit dispute, we will send a letter out to the brokers on either side, just making them aware that this dispute is in existence, because that was the big gripe. It's like, well, you send it to the agents, but we don't know, and we're the ones who are holding these deposits, and we just got a request from somebody saying to release it. So that's why there's trying to be a little bit more communicative when it comes to that. But yeah, I mean, I know brokerages in particular that have consulted with us, they have escrows that they've been holding for 10, 15 years. Legally, they can't disperse it, and the value is not worth proceeding with a lawsuit to pay it into court. So they'll just continue to hold it. They send letters every year, trying to get people to do anything, and nothing's coming. But yep. And then you have your end clauses. Make sure you guys are doing this. I got a call the other day that, I think it just out of a force of habit, one agent was on every single property, they would have the buyers receive the lead-based paint. If you're not providing a lead-based paint disclosure, the buyer should not be initialing that, right? Okay, so that's, and obviously it applies to anything. If they haven't received a deposit money notice, they shouldn't be initialing that. But that is what kind of saves you guys, is because you're saying, hey, you got the consumer notice, you got the statement of estimated cost, and you got all of these other documents that I was supposed to legally provide to you based on my ethics and my needs. All right, any other questions you guys have? I know I've kind of talked too long anyway. I was only supposed to go to 3:30. Yes, go ahead.
Contingency of sale. So contingency sale addendum runs out. Seller, it goes into the seller's court then, as far as whether or not they're willing to extend day by day, or they can just terminate at any point in time, correct?
So I thought I had that. Yeah, so we're doing is it a timed kick out? Is it, okay. sale
Direct,
and
let's
settlement?
let's say it's a direct kick out.
Okay, so say you have a sale and settlement. Are they under an agreement of sale yet, or are they
Yes.
gonna market? So the buyer and seller are under, or buyer has had agreement to sell their replacement property. Okay, and what was the question after that?
So we get past the contingency date.
Yes.
Property has not sold.
Okay,
Do not extend the contingency. It falls into the seller's lap then, as far as willing to
determine.
terminate,
That's
because the buyer still can't terminate.
Correct. Yes.
Right. And if settlement date comes and goes, again, buyer cannot necessarily terminate.
So I would say if the settlement time comes and goes, you as the buyer can say, we're no longer under a contract.
Right.
And as a result of that, because I wasn't able to do that, I'm asking for a return of the deposit. If you don't agree, then we'll take it to mediation at that point. But
Okay.
yes, if that time period goes, the seller has the trigger and they control that
Right.
termination. Yep.
And at that point, we would say, well, the property wouldn't sell, and if the buyer wanted to take their existing property off the market, they could.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Good question. Anybody else?
How does the hotline work? Like, I've never called.
Just call.
I mean, but you're not answering your phone, so that's why I'm like,
Well, yeah,
yeah, so how does
it'll
it
go
look
to
like
my-
for you is what I'm asking.
Like a
I don't want to put more stuff over
No.
it.
And that's why I'm asking, what
So
are the
you-
logistics
yep,
of it?
Call 717, it's 846-9800, and then you let the receptionist know that it's a
Right.
react hotline. They put you either directly to me,
Okay.
or it'll go to my voicemail. You can also shoot me an email. It's pruth@stockandleader.com.
So you just kind of get things as you can.
Yeah, I know like.
I didn't know if you had set
PAR
times
No,
or-
PAR has a set times and you can call it,
Okay.
but mine is pretty much open. I answer, as most people here know.
Do you
emails
always
on
have stuff to
weekends.
answer?
Oh, all the time. And don't worry, it is all anonymous. I know a lot of people are like, oh, he's gonna pick up the phone and call my broker after this or something,
Yeah.
but it helps me stay attuned with what's going on, and then also it's gonna help other agents, because if you're going through it, odds are somebody else.
Are you usually like responding within a day, or what's your turnaround?
At least within a day. I would say.
Okay, you won't like go to bed without something usually.
Can't guarantee that, but-
You know, some
No,
people
yeah.
wait like days without you. I don't know.
No,
what
I
to
try to
expect.
do
Not
it
all
within-
attorneys are.
I try to do
prompt.
it within 8 hours.
Gotcha. Yeah, so
yeah.
usually within some time.
Unless he's in court.
So if I call at 11 at night, you're not gonna answer that day. Got it.
It's not if you call my work phone, no, but I'll get an email.
No, that makes sense. I was just wondering what it looked like on the back end for you.
I
Okay.
think I've spoken to a few people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've called.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So.
I called at 11 o'clock on a Friday night and you called me back at 9 AM on Saturday morning. So that was very helpful.
I go to bed. I wake up very early, so I go to bed.
And he's
That's my
got little
only
ones.
Yeah, yes, so. But, well, thank you guys for
Yeah,
having me.
thank
Greatly
Thank you
appreciate
for
it.
your-
And yeah, absolutely.
So is this helpful for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, we have to end with Keller Williams ahas. So what are our ahas? Agents helping agents. That's what it stands for.
Peter's awesome.
What were some of your big takeaways? What were things that you learned? I learned I need to fix the Zoom for tomorrow's meeting. That's what I learned.
I learned that it can be clean and green under 10 acres, which I didn't know.
Yeah, the green and clean.
I noticed that the digital portion of that contract was like, hey, you're seeing a house that has nest or whatever, the ring, and if you fall and bust your butt, they can put it on the internet. You can't do anything about it.
So if you guys like
That happened
hearing
in
all the little
California.
cool anecdotes,
Yeah.
you should run for the board because you get to hear all of this stuff like in real time. And it's very cool to know it like years before anybody else.
Yep.
So,
And you get to review all the ethics
and
cases.
you get to review all the ethics
Yeah.
cases and you get to
Real
hear
juicy.
all of this information like on a monthly basis. You get to
Right.
hear like all the cool little tidbits. So I'd encourage anybody in the future to consider running for the board because then you get to throw your questions at Peter
There you go.
consistently.
Any other takeaways or nuggets? Did everybody get their questions answered?
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do have one.
Likewise.
I do have one, but I don't know if you're allowed to like test, but you know, the part with the waiving the financing contingency, do you truly have a cash offer? Is there a way to strengthen that you're getting a cash offer? I know when I came from another brokerage, they had us like strike through the part
Mhm.
about financing, obtaining, and then just initial that. Does
Yeah.
that hold weight?
Or at the additional
What would you
terms.
recommend?
Yeah, the
Okay,
additional terms. at
this
the
is a
end.
cash offer.
Yeah,
no
buyer
fee.
will not finance any portion of the purchase price.
Okay,
And that's the easiest. Now, again, practical perspective is the money will be green. It will be in your account on the day of settlement or they're in default. So does it really matter? But to
Sure,
your point,
logistics
if
of
they're
it.
not
Yeah.
specifically saying that, then based on the contract, you can finance. So, yeah, the buyer will not
so
finance any portion
straight
of purchase
through or
price.
just adding.
Mhm.
Gotcha.
So I always thought that that meant that no matter what, that still, they were held to the fire on it. They still had to purchase the property
Mhm.
cash. Is that true?
Well, so the mortgage financing contingency says that if I can't get the money, I don't have a way to terminate. Now, realistically, if you can't get the money, I can't that's why there's no like specific performance. You could sue a seller to sell you the property because they have the ability to sign a deed.
Yeah.
To force a buyer to buy a property if they don't have money to do so, is a little bit different. But that's why if you have that box checked, you're gonna be entitled to that deposit money at the end of the day. Because and just when you're dealing as a practical thing, I know it can be frustrating for your sellers when you feel like, hey, this buyer has like looped us along. We're gonna keep them in contract and I know they want out, but we're gonna make that is a very difficult transaction for everybody, including the seller at that point. So a lot of times it just makes more sense to say, okay, I know we're miffed, we'll curse your name or whatever, but we'll let you go, we'll let them out, and then we'll move on and hopefully find find somebody else, because really, if they can't get the money, they can't buy it, and all you're gonna get is a deposit at the end of the day. Why not move on to somebody else?
Because I just thought that checking that box, cash, or, and just, saying that they could potentially get financing meant that irregardless, they had the cash to buy it. So that's not,
Nope.
okay,
No. Unless you get proof of funds, I mean, that's all, but that would be another way to do it.
okay.
Yeah,
all right.
buyer shall demonstrate proof of funds for the entire amount of the purchase.
Because a lot of
price.
agents were
Yeah.
doing that these last couple of years. That's how I learned about it at our old brokerage, just
Yeah.
because people were being sneaky, just thinking, hey, there's cash offer, and then they would just go
Yeah.
apply for financing. It was just a way to get in the door.
Because thank God my one big one did go through just that way, but they marked it cash, did provide proof of funds for the cash, but ended up did financing through a personal, money. But yeah, good
Does
to
an
know.
appraisal contingency have to be elected though under that box? Like they aren't entitled to an appraisal
They can
if
get
they're
everything.
doing cash.
Yeah.
So
They can
yes,
do
yeah,
it.
they
So
appraise.
So it's not, I thought it was for the financing
No.
part, so they could,
So that was a change that was made. Anytime,
Okay.
anybody, even if you waive, that applies to you if you've selected to get financing. Then it says, additionally, I am going to make my offer contingent upon my ability to get that financing. You're just disclosing, I may finance this, and if I do, I agree to abide by all this stuff. And then right below that, you're saying either I'm going to make this offer contingent upon it, or I'm gonna waive my contingency, so that if I can't get that loan based on all the stuff that I've selected, you get to keep my deposit, or I have to come up
so
with
if you
another
want
way
a
to
true
buy it.
cash offer, you need to just
Modify the terms.
modify that.
Or
appraisal.
ask for proof of funds for the entire purchase amount upfront.
But even if you see that, they can still do fine.
It's true, yeah,
right?
but at least you'll have a sense of comfort that, oh,
Right.
you couldn't get the loan, but you still have the money to buy.
Oh,
it.
sure,
Right,
So,
right.
right, and get a
Okay.
larger deposit,
sure.
that's the other benefit.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Appreciate your
absolutely,
time.
thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck, guys.
Hey, and Aaron.
Aaron, Jason.
Oh, nice to see you.
Yeah.
I did, yeah. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate
You
it.
too.
So, did you learn a lot?
Yeah.
Good.
That's what coffee does to me.
Last year.
Especially a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that what you,
Yeah.
is that what they told you in school to do?
Yeah, I know. There's always something to pull away. in there.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming. We're also doing one-on-one goal setting and business planning. That's also free of charge for 2023. So if you're interested, just email me and we'll set up a 30-minute consultation.
Okay.
Okay?
All right, thank
Thanks
you.
for coming.
Yeah.
Is Ryan here?
Yeah, he's here. Well,
I might run that question by him, or is he busy? He's here, but not
goes 4 o'clock. So I don't know if he's still here. That's the question. Hold on. Before you waddle your way upstairs.
Oh, I can. My gut tells me just to go through with FHA and just figure it out, and it'll be
If
fine.
you're gonna get another appraisal.
Or should I just, if I'm being sure, go with another conventional one? I want to hear what he has to say.
Or you could also just have it reappraised.
I mean, it's gotta be anyway. It's got, if they gotta go FHA, then they gotta do it anyway. That's the problem. Because their agent didn't inform them of capital gains, so now they don't have the money. So they have to rechange their financing anyway. So to me, I'm like, if you're gonna do an FHA loan, to me, this is the sticking point. I'm cool with FHA. But your people need to understand that we're taking the value of the new one. I don't want them stuck on the value of the 300 on this